What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
I don't think I ever really believed I was loved. Not the way a daughter is supposed to feel it, not warm or safe or unshakably certain. Growing up, I always felt like a guest in my own family, like I had snuck into someone else's house and was just waiting for the moment I'd be asked to leave. My mom, Elaine, was the kind of woman people in town respected, put together, sharp-tongued, the type who always remembered to send thank you cards and never let her lipstick fade in public, but behind closed doors, her affection was selective, sparse, and mostly saved for my two younger brothers. David and Josh were her pride, her golden boys, football trophies and clean report cards decorating the mantel like they were family heirlooms. With them, she had this glow, laughing at their dumb jokes, defending them like a lioness whenever someone even looked at them sideways. But with me, there was always something clipped in her tone, something tight and polite and, worst of all, performative. She did what she had to do, made my school lunches, drove me to piano lessons, signed the report cards, but there was no softness in it. No real joy. And over time, I stopped asking for it. I remember my 16th birthday more vividly than most people remember their wedding days. She was supposed to come to the dinner I planned myself, just a small thing at a diner with a few friends, and she didn't show up. No explanation. I got a card in the mail 2 days later that read, "Be better this year." That was it. No love, no apology. Just 3 words that felt like a damn performance review from a boss I was about to disappoint again. Even as an adult, that same cold current ran underneath every conversation. We talked, sure, holidays, birthdays, the occasional passive-aggressive phone call where she'd ask why I wasn't married yet or remind me my biological clock wasn't gonna wait for me to figure myself out. But warmth? No. It was always obligation dressed up as concern. So when she called me a week before her birthday, her 62nd, she made sure to mention, like it was a milestone of national importance, and said she needed me to come home. I was skeptical. "It's important," she said, "and that's all." No details. Just a tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. Something in her voice felt loaded, like a final judgment had already been made and my presence was required to make it official. And here's the part that most people won't understand unless they've lived it. Even after everything, some part of me still wanted to believe maybe this time it would be different. That maybe she had softened with age, maybe she wanted to make peace. Maybe she wanted to tell me I wasn't invisible to her anymore. So I packed a bag, canceled a weekend meeting with a major client, and drove 400 miles back to the house I once called home. On the passenger seat next to me sat a manila envelope, unassuming, quiet, almost boring, but the weight of it? It was heavy enough to crush 30 years of doubt. Inside was something I hadn't even looked at yet, the results of a DNA test I'd taken 5 weeks earlier, the result of a conversation that still kept me up at night. It was Thanksgiving, the last one I agreed to spend with my family, and I was sitting in the kitchen with Aunt Carol, my mom's younger sister, who had just polished off her 3rd glass of wine. She leaned in close and said, with that drunken mix of affection and nostalgia, "You were such a miracle baby, Lena. No one expected you to come home from that hospital at all." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked. She blinked like she hadn't realized she'd spoken aloud. "Oh, just that you were so tiny. And Elaine, well, it wasn't easy for her. You know how she struggled to get pregnant before you." I didn't know. Not really. My mom never talked about that. Hell, she never talked about much at all. But something about the way Carol said it, like it was part of a larger story I wasn't allowed to hear, kept needling at me. And then it hit me. In all the dozens of photo albums on the shelves of our family room, there wasn't a single picture of me as a baby. Not one. David had baby pics. Josh had full scrapbooks. But me? I didn't show up until maybe 2 years old, standing next to a Christmas tree with a look on my face like I'd already learned not to trust the person behind the camera. So I ordered the test. Told myself it was just curiosity. A fun little genetics thing, like everyone else was doing these days. But the minute it arrived, I hesitated. Left it unopened on my kitchen counter for a week. Because some part of me already knew, not just that something was wrong, but that everything I'd been pretending to ignore was about to scream back at me through medical facts and raw numbers. I finally did it one night with a glass of cheap wine and a shaking hand. Spit into the tube, sealed the box, and mailed it the next morning. I told no one. I didn't even check the tracking. I just waited like someone sitting on a bomb she built herself, not knowing when or if it would go off. Now, in the car, with her house just 20 minutes away, I still hadn't opened the results. The envelope sat next to me like it was alive, like it knew exactly what it carried and was just waiting for the perfect moment to explode. Part of me thought about ripping it open right then and there, just to prepare myself. But another part, the sharper, colder, more strategic part, said no. Wait. There's power in timing. When I pulled into the driveway, nothing looked different. Same shutters, same lawn chairs, same porch swing that I was never allowed to use because it was for guests. But inside, I could feel the shift, not in the house, but in me. This time, I wasn't walking in as the quiet daughter begging for approval. I was walking in with a question buried in my back pocket and an answer riding shotgun. And I had the kind of smile on my face that only comes when you're about to find out just how deep someone else's lies really go. The night before I left for my mother's birthday, I sat alone at my kitchen table, a single low light humming above me, casting long shadows across the counter and making the unopened envelope on the table seem even more ominous than it had been for the past 2 weeks. That manila packet hadn't moved since the day it arrived. It had sat in that exact same spot, untouched, unbothered, like a loaded gun no one wanted to acknowledge in the middle of a quiet suburban home. I think part of me believed that as long as I didn't open it, the answers inside couldn't change anything, couldn't unmake the version of my life I had spent 4 decades trying to hold together with duct tape and denial. But I also knew that fear wasn't going to protect me anymore, and pretending not to wonder had never actually stopped the wondering. I poured a glass of wine, cheap, red, the kind that tastes more like sour guilt than any sort of luxury, and I stared at that envelope for what must have been an hour, letting my fingers trace its edges like maybe I could feel the truth through paper, like maybe the words inside would seep into my skin and prepare me for what was coming. But of course, that's not how it works. You don't get to prepare for a moment like that. You only get to choose whether you face it standing or on your knees. I broke the seal slowly, carefully, as if doing it gently would soften the blow of whatever was inside, and then, once the top flap gave way, I pulled out the contents and unfolded the sheet. It was one of those glossy reports they send now, all full-color charts and tidy pie graphs, so clinical, so clean, as if identity were a science experiment and not a fragile, tangled web of memory and longing. But my eyes weren't looking for percentages or genetic markers. I was looking for names. And there it was, right at the top of the section labeled Close Family, First-Degree Matches. The name hit me like a slap across the face. Nancy Kessler. Female. Age range matched. Location listed as Indiana. And under relationship, likely biological mother. The words didn't make sense at first. I kept rereading them, thinking maybe I was misunderstanding, maybe there was an error, maybe it meant something else, something less final, something less devastating. But the more I stared, the clearer it became. Not only was Elaine not my biological mother, but someone else had been carrying my DNA, somewhere far away, for decades, while I had been living in the shadow of a woman who never once made me feel like I belonged to her. There was no match for David. No match for Josh. No connection to anyone else in the family that I had grown up with. The results were dry, objective, clinical, and yet they spoke louder than any argument we had ever had. They screamed what I had always feared in the back of my mind, what I had tried to bury under years of forced smiles and awkward phone calls and cold Christmases. I was not one of them. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. What I felt wasn't sadness, at least not in the way people usually describe it. It was more like a quiet kind of fury, the kind that lives under the ribs and burns slowly, patiently, waiting for a reason to finally be named. Because now I knew. All those years of being treated like an outsider, like I was someone else's problem, like I had to work twice as hard to earn half as much love, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was written in blood. I sat back in the chair, the wine untouched, the report open on the table, and I let the silence settle around me like a second skin. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not in the dramatic, movie scene way where a person gasps and swears vengeance, but in a colder, more calculating sense. The kind of shift that happens when you realize someone's been lying to your face for your entire life, and you finally decide you're not going to smile through it anymore. I looked up Nancy Kessler on Facebook. It took less than a minute. There she was, a woman in her 60s with soft eyes, a warm smile, holding a pie in one picture and a baby in another, probably a grandchild. Her profile was public enough to see that she lived in a small town in Indiana, had 2 grown sons, and regularly posted about her church, her garden, and her search for a daughter she gave up in 1982. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying ease. I read a post she had written just 3 months earlier. Another birthday passes. My sweet girl would be 41 this year. I hope she's safe. I hope she knows I never stopped looking. I didn't message her. Not yet. I wasn't ready. I had a different confrontation to handle first. One that involved the woman who had raised me, who had lied to me, and who now, for reasons I couldn't yet understand, wanted me at her birthday party for the first time in 5 years. Something told me she had an agenda. Elaine always had an agenda, and whatever it was, she expected me to show up quietly, politely, to sit in her curated little gathering and act like I didn't notice the ice under her smile. But this time, I was walking in with knowledge. Real, hard, scientific knowledge. And she didn't know I had it. The next morning, I packed my bag. I didn't take much. Just a few things, a change of clothes, toiletries, the manila envelope now creased from how many times I had read it. I slid it into a folder and placed it carefully at the top of my suitcase. I wanted it close. Not for drama. Not for spectacle. But because it had become my armor. The truth, no matter how painful, had finally taken shape, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to use it. I got in the car and began the long drive back to the town I had spent most of my life trying to escape. The roads were quiet, the sky overcast, and my thoughts spiraled with every mile marker I passed. I thought about birthdays where I blew out candles in silence, about school concerts where Elaine sat with her arms crossed, about scraped knees and awkward conversations, and all the times I had told myself, she loves you. She just doesn't know how to show it. Now I wondered if she had ever loved me at all, or if I had just been a problem she solved decades ago and never expected to come back with questions. I didn't know what would happen when I walked into that house. I didn't know why she wanted me there or what stunt she was planning to pull in front of our so-called family. But I did know this. Whatever she was about to say, whatever performance she was preparing to give, she had no idea that I already knew her biggest secret. And sometimes, the quietest revenge is just letting someone talk, while you hold the truth in your hands and wait for the perfect moment to speak. By the time I pulled into my mother's driveway, the sky was heavy with late afternoon clouds, that kind of pale gray light that doesn't quite know whether it wants to rain or just linger in dull silence. And I remember thinking how perfectly it matched the tone I expected for the evening, not dramatic, not stormy, just cold, passive-aggressive, and vaguely disappointing, like every holiday we'd ever spent together under the same roof. The house, with its pristine white siding and carefully trimmed hedges, looked exactly as I remembered, unchanged by time or memory, still holding on to that air of forced perfection my mother had always demanded of everything she controlled, from her children's clothes to the arrangement of the couch pillows. There were already too many cars parked in front, their polished surfaces reflecting the same sterile neatness as the rest of her life, and I recognized most of the license plates, which only made the knot in my stomach twist a little tighter. It wasn't just a birthday dinner, it was an event. I parked further down the street, deliberately choosing not to take the spot my brothers usually reserved for me, and walked slowly toward the house, my heels clicking against the pavement, the weight of the folder in my purse heavier than it had any right to be. Like it knew exactly what kind of conversation it was about to ignite. I paused at the front door, took a breath that didn't help, and rang the bell, a stupid thing, considering I had grown up there and still remembered exactly which floorboard creaked 3 steps in, but something about the formality felt necessary. Like I was acknowledging this wasn't home anymore, and maybe never had been. Elaine opened the door herself, not the housekeeper, which struck me immediately as odd, because my mother hadn't answered her own front door in over a decade unless it was for a photo opportunity or someone delivering something expensive. She looked exactly the same, perfectly ironed blouse, pearls at the neck, makeup done with that clinical precision she applied to everything, and yet, as she stood there looking at me, something in her eyes was different. Not soft, not welcoming. Measured. Like I was a box on her to-do list, and she was already mentally crossing me off. "You're late," she said, not even offering a hello, and stepped aside to let me in with the grace of someone hosting a board meeting, not a family gathering. I stepped into the hallway, instantly hit by the familiar scent of her perfume, sharp and citrusy, the same one she'd worn since I was a kid, the smell of tension and rules and judgment, and heard the low hum of polite conversation coming from the living room. The house was full. Too full. I recognized neighbors, cousins, a few of her church friends, even David and Josh standing near the kitchen with their wives, both avoiding my gaze like they had been warned not to make eye contact. Everyone was dressed up. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter floated on the air like some artificial soundtrack. This wasn't a birthday dinner, it was a performance. Elaine walked ahead of me, not looking back to see if I followed, and I trailed her into the main room, where the conversations paused just long enough to register my presence before everyone forced their smiles back into place and returned to pretending they hadn't noticed the awkward shift in energy. I stood near the edge of the room, unsure of what to do with myself, and that's when she did it without fanfare, without any sense of decency or timing. My mother turned to the room, gently tapped her champagne glass with a fork, and said, in that cool, clipped voice she reserved for public statements, "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate another year of blessings. I am so grateful to have my loved ones here, well, most of them." The silence that followed was brutal, stretched too long, and filled with the kind of tension you could feel pressing down on your chest. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched her, knowing somehow, already knowing, what was coming next. She continued, still holding her glass, eyes locked on me now. "Some people in this room have spent years pretending, manipulating, taking advantage of this family's goodwill. But I've made peace with the truth, and it's time I stopped pretending. Lena, you are no longer part of this family. I release you from any obligation to us, and I release myself from any obligation to you." There was a collective intake of breath, the kind that only happens when people realize they're witnessing something truly inappropriate but are too stunned or polite to interrupt. My brothers looked away. One of their wives blinked like she was about to cry. Aunt Carol put a hand to her mouth and whispered something I couldn't hear. And I just stood there, frozen, hearing my mother sever me like a loose thread in front of 30 people, as if I were a business liability she had finally decided to write off. I didn't react. I didn't cry or scream or storm out, which I'm sure she expected, because humiliation had always been her weapon of choice. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out the folder I had carried across 400 miles, and placed it gently on the glass table next to the untouched cake, which now looked ridiculous under the chandelier's bright light, like a child's party centerpiece at a funeral. Then I looked her straight in the eyes, not with rage, not with sadness, but with the kind of calm clarity that only comes from knowing you've already won, and said, "I understand. It makes sense now why you could never love me. The DNA results came in yesterday. You're not my mother. And I'm not your problem anymore." I turned and walked out. No one followed. No one called after me. The door clicked shut behind me, the same way it had when I left for college, for work, for good, always a click, always a wall. As I stepped onto the front lawn, the sky finally opened up and started to rain, light at first, then heavier, like even the weather couldn't keep holding its breath. I didn't run to the car. I didn't hide under the porch. I just stood there for a moment, letting the water soak into my clothes, letting the coolness replace the heat that had risen in my chest inside that room. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel rejected. I felt free. Inside my car, my phone buzzed. A new message. I picked it up with shaking hands, expecting maybe one of my brothers had grown a spine. But it wasn't them. The message read, "I've been looking for you for years. Please call me when you can. Nancy." I stared at the screen, rain tapping gently on the windshield like a clock ticking down toward something inevitable. And in that moment, I realized that the worst part of the story was over. But the real story, the one I had been denied for 4 decades, was just about to begin. I didn't call Nancy right away, not because I didn't want to, not because I wasn't desperately curious, aching, terrified, exhausted, and trembling at the edges of something that felt too big to even begin to name, but because I knew that once I dialed that number, once her voice came through the receiver and confirmed what that envelope and those words had already whispered into my bones, there would be no going back, no more pretending, no more safe delusion that the life I had lived was merely flawed rather than entirely fabricated, no more playing along with a story that never quite belonged to me. Instead, I spent the night in a hotel on the edge of town, one of those places with the scratchy bedspreads and the humming ice machines and the weak orange light leaking through the heavy curtains, a place where no one would know my name, where I could lay on my back and stare at the ceiling in perfect anonymity, trying to string together the pieces of my identity like mismatched beads on a snapped necklace. The message from Nancy had been brief, almost clinical in tone, as though she didn't dare pour emotion into something so fragile, as though she feared that if she said too much too soon, she'd scare me away, or worse, make it real. I reread it a dozen times before finally pressing her name into my contacts list and saving it under Nancy K, because I didn't know what else to call her, because calling her mom felt absurd, grotesque even, like I was stealing something sacred from a stranger. And yet, some quiet part of me, the part that still remembered lying awake in bed as a child, wondering why I felt so alone under the roof of the woman who was supposed to be my mother, was already calling her that in whispers I couldn't quite stop. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon the next day when I finally gathered the courage to press call, my hand trembling against the screen as the dial tone rang once, then twice, and then a third time before a voice soft, cautious, cracked by age and history said, "Hello." And for a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, mouth open, heart racing, staring out the hotel window at a world that suddenly felt alien and surreal, because that voice, though entirely unfamiliar, sent a chill down my spine so visceral that I had to grip the edge of the bed just to steady myself. "Hi," I finally managed, my voice smaller than I intended. This is Lena. You messaged me." The silence that followed was thick and long, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighty, as if the very air between us had been holding its breath for 4 decades and finally dared to exhale. And then she said my name, slowly, like it hurt to say, but also healed something at the same time. Lena. That was it. Just my name. But in that one syllable, I heard 1,000 unspoken things: grief, regret, guilt, hope, and I knew, without any doubt, that she was who the DNA said she was. We spoke for 2 hours that day, neither of us knowing exactly how to navigate the impossible terrain of such a conversation, both stumbling through questions and half-truths and raw memories like 2 people walking across broken glass barefoot, careful not to bleed too much at once. She told me she had been 17 when she got pregnant, terrified, living in a small town with a mother who believed shame was worse than death and a father who believed punishment was love. She had been sent away to a home for girls, where the staff taught obedience more than compassion and where babies were born in silence and whisked away with paperwork and polite smiles. Nancy said she held me once, just once, for 27 minutes before a nurse took me from her arms and promised her I would be going to a good family, to a woman who had tried for years to have a child and couldn't. That woman, she said, was named Elaine. And that name alone, said in Nancy's voice, soft and tentative, landed like a knife, twisted slow and deep. I asked her if she had known anything about Elaine before the adoption, and Nancy said no, only what the agency had told her, that she was married, stable, desperate for a child, and well-connected, whatever that meant. But what Nancy hadn't known, and what she would find out years later when she started looking for me, was that the adoption had not been entirely legal. The agency had been shut down in the early 90s for multiple violations, and many of the records from those years had vanished or been altered. Nancy had spent the better part of a decade trying to track down what had happened to me, hiring private investigators, writing letters, even going on talk shows in the early 2000s in a last-ditch effort to attract attention. She showed me the clip later, her younger, desperate face staring into the camera, holding up a picture of me as a toddler that had been sent anonymously in the mail. To this day, she doesn't know who sent it. But that photo, the only one she had of me, kept her going. She never remarried. Never had more daughters. Just 2 sons from a marriage that didn't last, and a small house with too many empty picture frames. I never stopped hoping, she said, her voice cracking just once, but I stopped expecting. You can only live in grief for so long before it eats everything. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know how to apologize for a loss I didn't cause, or accept grief that wasn't mine, or reconcile the image of her soft, emotional, loving, with the memory of Elaine's backhanded affection and clinical detachment. And yet, the longer we spoke, the more I felt like some part of me was thawing, like there was warmth creeping into places that had been frozen for so long I had forgotten what it meant to feel safe in someone's voice. She invited me to come visit. No pressure, no guilt. If you want to, she said, I have pie. And I laughed, actually laughed, because it was the first time in days that someone had spoken to me without an angle, without bitterness, without expectation. I said yes. 3 days later, I drove to Indiana, through flat fields and sleepy towns, pulling up to a small blue house with white shutters and a porch swing out front that looked like it had stories to tell. Nancy opened the door before I even knocked, and for a moment we just stared at each other, mother and daughter, strangers and family, wound and scar. She stepped forward and hugged me, and for the first time in my life, I felt held. Not tolerated. Not corrected. Not compared or judged or measured. Just held. That afternoon, she made tea, and we sat on the porch swing while she showed me pictures of her life, not to prove anything, not to boast, just to share. And somewhere between the second cup and the faded photo of her holding me for those 27 stolen minutes, she said something I will never forget. Elaine didn't steal just you. She stole the life I would have built around you. And in that moment, something in me broke, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that finally let light through. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because as we sat there, watching the sun dip below the trees, Nancy pulled out an envelope of her own, one filled with documents, names, phone numbers, and questions she had never been able to answer. And one of those names? It was someone from my childhood. Someone I never expected to see again. The past, it seemed, wasn't done unraveling. Not yet. The envelope Nancy handed me that evening was thinner than I expected, just a few sheets of paper, folded neatly and held together by a single rusted paperclip, the kind of item you might overlook on a cluttered desk, mistaking it for nothing more than old correspondence or forgotten receipts. And yet, as she passed it to me with hands that trembled only slightly, her eyes heavy with the weight of 4 decades of unanswered questions, I understood that what it contained wasn't just information, but the final threads of a story too long ignored, too long twisted, too long denied the dignity of daylight. The pages inside weren't dramatic in presentation, no bold lettering, no underlining, no sense of theater, just a quiet, methodical collection of notes, photocopied articles, handwritten memos, and one name, in particular, that stopped me in my tracks before I had even finished reading the second page, Dr. Daniel Kincaid. At first, I couldn't place it. The name felt familiar, but not in a way I could immediately contextualize, like a song you heard on the radio once years ago that comes back to you in fragments, and you're left chasing melody and memory, trying to piece it together. Nancy watched my face closely, not interrupting, just waiting for the recognition to settle in, and it did, suddenly, and with such force that I sat back in the porch swing, the folder limp in my lap. The air knocked clean out of my lungs by a name I hadn't heard since I was a child. Dr. Kincaid, he was my mother's fertility specialist, or at least that was the story she told everyone. She mentioned him rarely, and always with a note of forced gratitude, the kind of hollow reverence someone uses when they're parroting a line they think they're supposed to say, not something they actually feel. I remembered hearing his name once at a Christmas party when I was maybe 10, overhearing a woman from church ask Elaine if she still kept in touch with that doctor who helped you with Lena. Elaine had smiled tightly and said no. That chapter closed a long time ago, before swiftly changing the subject to the woman's casserole. But now, seeing his name on the page listed as one of the individuals under investigation during the late 80s for his role in a string of irregular adoptions through a now-defunct agency known as Evergreen Family Services, the puzzle that had haunted my entire life began to assemble itself in terrifying, clinical precision. Dr. Kincaid had been named in multiple internal memos, all hinting at private arrangements made with desperate prospective parents and certain unnamed intermediaries who operated within regional hospitals, all of it cloaked in euphemism and legal vagueness. No charges had ever stuck. No one had been formally prosecuted. But the whispers had never gone away, and neither had the trail Nancy had followed, one breadcrumb at a time, until it led straight to me. Nancy had never been given adoption papers. That, in and of itself, should have been a red flag. She'd been told her daughter was going to a closed placement, that contact would be impossible, and that once the baby was gone, there would be no record, no right to request updates, no legal standing to ever revisit the past. It had been phrased as protection for her, for me, for the process, but in truth, it had been about power. The kind of quiet, unchecked power held by people who believed that desperation was a license to manipulate and that wanting a child was justification enough for stealing one. For the rest of the evening, Nancy and I talked through every piece of the folder. She showed me phone logs, old newspaper articles, even a letter she had once sent to the state licensing board, asking for help in tracking down the clinic records, only to receive a generic response that the files had been sealed and the agency shuttered. None of it was conclusive in a courtroom sense, but to us, to any rational human, the picture was clear. Elaine had not adopted me through any legal or ethical channel. She had cut a deal, probably under the table, with a crooked doctor, and then spent the next 40 years shaping me into the quiet, obedient daughter who would never think to question how she ended up in a family that never seemed to quite fit. I drove home the next morning with that folder in the passenger seat, the sun rising slowly behind me, casting long streaks of gold across the dashboard, and I kept thinking over and over, not about vengeance or confrontation, but about legacy, about what it means to unearth the truth when everyone else is invested in keeping it buried, about what gets passed down when we don't question the narrative handed to us. I didn't want to become Elaine, didn't want to live in bitterness or spite or the empty theater of public outrage. But I also didn't want her walking away unscathed, swanning around town with her spotless reputation and her community awards and her smug sense of superiority, as though she hadn't stolen a life and spent decades gaslighting the girl at the center of it. So I made a plan, not loud, not explosive, but exacting. I compiled the documents, cleaned them up, included a quiet summary letter, and mailed them anonymously to the head of the committee that was preparing to present Elaine with the Lifetime Community Caregiver Award at the upcoming City Council Gala, an event she had bragged about for months, even casually inviting me to attend as if we hadn't just torched our relationship at her birthday. I also sent copies to 2 local reporters, one who covered government transparency and one who had recently written an op-ed on the lack of regulation in private adoption practices. I said nothing. I signed nothing. I let the information speak for itself. The fallout, when it came, was slow but unmistakable. The day of the gala, Elaine showed up in her usual pastel suit, pearls at the neck, makeup perfect, and left 15 minutes later, her face pale, her smile frozen, after a whispered conversation with a councilwoman that ended with her award being postponed indefinitely pending clarification of certain records. The news never ran a full story, just a quiet, pointed piece on questionable adoption practices from the 80s and the need for reform. But in a town like ours, that was more than enough. I didn't celebrate. I didn't toast my success. I didn't even tell Nancy what I had done. Because some revenge doesn't need witnesses. Some revenge is just about reclaiming space, about forcing someone to look in the mirror and see the cracks they've spent a lifetime pretending weren't there. And when Josh called me a few days later, not David, never David, but Josh, and said, in a voice thick with something like guilt, I don't know what the hell is going on, but I'm sorry. For everything. We were wrong. I didn't gloat or unload or demand repentance. I just said, you were kids. But your mom? She knew exactly what she was doing. Weeks later, I found myself back on Nancy's porch swing, the folder finally left behind, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea while the sun dipped low behind the trees. She asked what I was going to do now, her voice soft, almost afraid of the answer, and I smiled, not because everything had been fixed, it hadn't, but because, for the first time, I was speaking from a place that felt like mine. I don't need revenge anymore, I told her, staring out at the yard where her garden bloomed in thick, messy rows. I just needed the truth. And someone to swing with. The past hadn't disappeared. The pain hadn't vanished. But the silence that once defined me was finally broken. And in that space, something new had begun. Something honest. Something mine.